Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
This is why we fight. Democracy is at war. Across the world, we see the forces rallied against it. From the authoritarian regimes of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to techno-aristocrats, religious fundamentalists, and populist demagogues. In the battlefields of Ukraine to the Straits of Taiwan and the halls of power in the United States, democratic, free values are under determined assault. But there are those who resist. They are activists, journalists, academics, soldiers, religious leaders, and politicians. In this series, we will meet those who claim to be fighting for a free world. We will find out who they are, how they're involved in the struggle, what democracy means to them, and why it's worth fighting for. In this episode of Why We Fight, we're talking with Sheikh Said Ismagilov. He is one of Ukraine's most senior Islamic clerics and was Mufti of the Religious Administration of Muslims of Ukraine. He has been voted one of the top 100 most influential people in the country. He is also a veteran. He served in the liberation of Bucha and as a combat medic in the Battle of Bakhmut, as well as across the lines. We are meeting at the Kyiv Islamic Cultural Center, where, and I say this as a Briton, the tea is the best I have ever had. Join me as we find out what it meant to the Sheikh to defend both his faith and freedom. Sheikh, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
In the first invasion of 2014, you had to flee the Donbass under threat from the pro-Russian separatists. Why do you think they wanted to arrest you in particular?
Справа в тому, що спочатку, коли були дійсно місцеві сепаратисти.
At first they were really local separatists. They were such, a lumpenized part of the population who didn't actually represent the views of the population of Donetsk and Donbass. These were the people who most often had criminal records, usually had problems with alcoholism and drug addiction. They were unemployed. They were the ones who were gathered for money by Russia in order to demonstrate with their rallies and speeches that they wanted to come to Russia. As long as they were local freaks, they posed no threat. They were not people who could do us any harm, but then the situation changed. In mid-April, a group of armed Russian FSB officers led by Igor Girkin crossed the border and captured the first city in Donbass, the city of Slavyansk, where fighting with the Russian army actually began. Then they gathered in large columns and moved to Donetsk. From this time, it was no longer the local lumpen electorate, but the Russian special services and military. They captured Donetsk, and then it really became dangerous. In the summer of 2014, those FSB units that captured Donetsk started arresting and killing the local patriotic population. First of all, these are civic leaders, church leaders, political leaders, and so on. That is, it was already dangerous because they basically unleashed terror in Donetsk, and cities were under their control. But the turning point was the summer defeat of the Ukrainian army near Ilovaisk, when the regular Russian army actually violated Ukrainian border and in the Battle of Ilovaisk dealt a powerful blow to the Ukrainian army, which was not ready to face the Russian army directly. They expected to face local units and FSB officers, and did not expect that there would already be guns, Russian tanks, and thousands of Russian soldiers. After this defeat, it became clear that the occupation of Donetsk would be long-lasting and it would be serious fighting, as armored vehicles and Russian regular troops entered the part of Donbass that was occupied by the separatists at that time. Then they started arresting and killing those people who hadn't been touched until then. I was a well-known person until the Ilovaisk tragedy, before it became clear that this region was occupied for a long time. They, the Russians, did not dare to arrest famous people. For instance, they started arresting Christian priests, but in September they came to my house to arrest me. I already knew that this was to be expected, so I lived at a different address. When they came to arrest me, of course people informed me about it. I had to leave the next day, and under the guise of a university professor, I went to Mariupol, which had already been liberated by the Azov battalion. I left in September 2014 and never returned. After that, my teacher, a well-known religious scholar, Kozlovsky, was arrested in Donetsk. During interrogations, he saw the lists of people they were planning to arrest. After his release, he said that he also saw my name there. I have to say that the occupiers, they do it so that some pro-Ukrainian well-known leaders and well-known figures couldn't have stopped them from spreading the ideology of the Russian world there.
You've served in the Territorial Defence Battalion of Kiev and you've served as a combat medic. Did Islam play a role in your deciding to sign up and to serve?
Капеланом я після повномасштабного вторгнення майже не був. Я був капеланом-добровольцем ще за часів АТО, от починаючи з окупації
I was
Донбасу.
hardly a chaplain after the full-scale invasion. I was a volunteer chaplain during the ATO, starting with the occupation of Donbass, and when the full-scale invasion began on February 24th, I came here to the mosque, and there was no one there. All the people fled Kiev, evacuated, and the mosque was empty, and I went to volunteer medical battalion, where this unit was called as soon as possible, a part of the volunteer medical battalion, Hospitaliers, and in fact I started the war as a paramedic. The Islamic religion directly leads men to be defenders, and if someone attacks, it is a Muslim man's duty to defend his family, his children, his country. This is natural for Islam. And the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, fought with weapons in battles accordingly. Every Muslim should follow his example if they need to fight in battles. Once a man came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and asked, "O Messenger of the Allah, what I should do if a man with a weapon comes and wants to take away what belongs to me?" And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, told him to take a weapon and fight him. This man asked, "And if he kills me?" The Prophet Muhammad said, "Then you will be in heaven." This man asked, "And if I kill him?" Prophet Muhammad said, "Then he will go to hell." In the Holy Quran, God tells Muslims, and all people in general, to fight those who come to fight you, but do not show excesses. Do not show excesses means that a Muslim warrior should not kill civilians, not kill innocent people, not kill those who surrendered, not use any means that are inhumane, such as torture. What is forbidden in Islam is precisely what is meant by this: do not show excesses. That is, you fight your enemies, but without this kind of violence, abuse, torture, and so on. Therefore, it was absolutely clear to me. I live in Bucha, and the city of Bucha is now known all over the world because of the massacres of civilians. I say, I lived in Donetsk, and Donetsk was occupied by Russians. I moved to Bucha, and on the second day of the war, the Russians occupied Bucha. Where do I need to move so that the Russians will not come to my house again? On the second day of the war, we saw Russian troops entering Bucha. I was driving my car and saw an armored column coming from the direction of Gostomel. Without Russian flags, without Ukrainian insignia, I realized that they were Russians. I quickly turned around and drove to Kiev. The Russians occupied Bucha. They looted houses, including mine. My apartment was looted. They were killing civilians and raping women. We started working as paramedics in a volunteer medical battalion, and when Bucha was liberated, or rather the Russians fled, battles lasted for more than a month for Irpin, for Bucha. These are two cities that are next to each other, and in the end they were forced to flee, and literally in a half an hour they fled from Bucha. Then we came in with our troops, we drove through the streets, I saw these dead people, I saw what was left, I can even show you what was left of my house. I was a volunteer paramedic until October 2023, when I was mobilized into the armed forces of Ukraine. We worked after the Russians fled the Kiev region, we worked in Lysychansk, Luhansk region, in Bakhmut, in the Kherson region. There were many places where we worked as paramedics.
What is normal life like for the Islamic community in Ukraine, and how does it compare to Muslim life in modern Russia?
Я навчався в Ісламському університеті у Москві з 1997 по
I studied
2001.
at the Islamic University in Moscow from 1997 to 2001 and received a religious education there. Therefore, I know very well what is happening in Russia. In Russia, despite having a significant Muslim population, which is approximately 25 million, Muslims are second-class citizens. There is a high level of Islamophobia in the country. Muslims there do not have the same rights and freedoms as, for example, Orthodox Christians. Russia is an authoritarian state, where human rights and freedoms are not valued at all. Only the supreme power and imperial ambitions matter there. People's rights and freedoms are worth nothing. The state and the state officials do not value or respect them. In Ukraine, there is a high level of rights and freedoms, and Ukrainians aspire to live in a rule of law, free and democratic state. Currently, Russian propaganda is spreading lies that Ukrainians are no different from Russians. This is an absurd and terrible falsehood, as Ukrainians are indeed different from Russians. Russians are much closer in their views and mentality to countries such as Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, China and North Korea, closer in their customs, state system, mentality and values. Ukraine, on the other hand, is an absolutely European country where people value their own dignity, rights and freedoms. Absolutely European mentality. Muslims in Russia and Muslims in Ukraine are in completely different and very dissimilar situations. In Russia, Muslims are perceived as enemies. Their own population is treated as second-class citizens, slaves basically. In Ukraine, Muslims are absolutely normal citizens who have absolutely equal rights and freedoms as all other Ukrainians. We do not have Islamophobia or a condescending attitude towards Muslims as if they were from colonial countries. In Ukraine, Muslims are an organic part of our society. When I was the Mufti, even before the war, I proposed that the president should meet with representatives of religious minorities. I first met with Zelensky after his election as president. He held meetings with religious leaders, and I also participated in one of them. At that time, we suggested that the president should pay attention to religious minorities. However, he truly began to hold iftars during Ramadan from 2023 onwards, and he does this every year. And we in Ukraine did not really want things to be like they are in Russia. We saw and knew what was happening there, and we greatly valued the fact that we are Muslims of Ukraine, that our country is democratic, that we have the same rights as, for example, Christians. Everything suited us perfectly, and the Muslims of Ukraine never wanted to end up in Russia. Therefore, after the occupation of Crimea and Donbass, the Russian authorities launched powerful repressions against Muslims. Arrests, killings, attempts to force people abroad, to make them flee. This is because Muslims are treated badly in Russia.
Does he know anything about the current situation for Muslims living in Crimea?
Кримські татари – це корінний народ в Україні, в Криму, який там
The
сформувався.
Crimean Tatars are an indigenous people of Ukraine, of Crimea, who formed there over many millennia. This people formed and are Muslims. They had their own statehood from the 14th to 18th century. It was a separate, quite powerful state that had its own independence and culture. Therefore, its people has its own language, history, and culture. The Crimean Khanate, their state, was destroyed by Russia in the 18th century. The Tatars were under Russian occupation, and the Soviet leader Stalin completely deported the entire people to Central Asia in 1944. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent state and allowed the Crimean Tatars to return to Crimea. After the deportation, Russia settled Crimea with Russians who were brought from Russia and simply placed in the homes of deported Crimean Tatars. Therefore, a situation arose in Crimea where it was populated by the Russian population, and Crimean Tatars began to return there. And Ukrainians also began to live there. Returning to Crimea, Crimean Tatars faced conflicts with Russian population of Crimea who did not want to give back the Tatars' property. This was always a hotbed of tension and conflict on the peninsula. The Crimean Tatars have always been a pro-Ukrainian population in Crimea. They supported Ukrainian statehood, Ukrainian independence, and the fact that Crimea should always remain part of Ukraine. When Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, it began to take revenge on the Crimean Tatars and organized powerful repressions against the leaders of the Crimean Tatar people.
Going back to your experience in the conflict, in this war, serving as a combat medic in Bakhmut and in nearly every part of the front, as you've said, you've touched on your experience before, but I note, and I saw a video of you reading, I think it was the Surah Al-Feth in Bakhmut, and I was wondering what your experience was like spiritually to be involved in such a brutal conflict.
Я записував такі відео, це правда, да, от є в мене на каналі в Ютубі, в вільний час. Тобто от був час, коли я працював як парамедик, а був час, коли я відпочивав.
They are on my YouTube channel. That is, there was a time when I worked as a paramedic, and there was a time when I rested. And I made such content, Muslim content, to show Muslims around the world and Muslims in Russia that first of all, we are Muslims of Ukraine. We are fighting for our land, we rely on God, and we are not afraid of the enemy. And I made this content with a certain propaganda purpose to influence Muslims in Russia, and I continue to do so, and I will continue to do so.
What effect do you hope to have on Muslims in Russia with your media work?
Я спілкувався з мусульманами Росії, які потрапили в нас в полон.
I spoke with Muslims from Russia who were captured by us. I spoke with about 20 people of different ages, but they were all Muslims. And some of these conversations are on my YouTube channel, and almost all of these prisoners are not locals. They went to fight and kill us for money. I ask, did you just come to kill us for money? Would you have killed me because the Russian state pays you money? And when they are captured, they are afraid. They are scared, and they say they are ashamed that they did not want to kill, but it is clear that they went to kill to earn money. I ask them, do you have children, a family? And what if you died here? You are lucky that you were captured, but what if you had died? What would you have left your children without a father at all? How would they have lived? I realize that these are people who are morally at a very low level, because it does not evoke any resistance in their souls that they simply kill other people for money. And with my informational activities, with my propaganda, I want to influence the Muslims of Russia so they do not come to kill us for money, because it is a sin from the point of view of Islam, and it is absolutely immoral for any normal, mentally healthy person. Frankly, I understand that Ukraine has only one opportunity to win this war, to dismantle Russia so that Russia breaks up into many independent states. And the weakest point in Russia is precisely the Muslim republics, the Islamic regions. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, no one expected it to break up into so many states. Similarly, when Russia collapses, it will be completely unexpected, and it is necessary to work with the Muslim population of Russia so that they want to become independent states. If Chechnya, Dagestan, Bashkortostan, Tatarstan and other republics begin to secede from Russia, Russia will crumble and will not have the power to fight Ukraine. Processes of loss of statehood and separation of regions will begin in Russia, and it will not be able to fight Ukraine. And in these conditions, Ukraine will quickly liberate its occupied territories. Sometimes an observer, perhaps from Europe, might think that Russia is such a monolith, such a state, that it will never fall. In reality, I know the situation inside, and there is very, very strong hatred between different peoples. The conflicts between them are very old and very acute, because, for example, Russians are considered the first-class population, Muslims are second-class, and Buryats, Tuvans, Yakuts are not even considered human beings by them.
Actually, I'm just curious to follow on from that. Given the current state of Chechnya, does he think that's likely, given Kadyrov's hold on power there?
Чечня двічі воювала з Росією за свою незалежність. Було дві потужні великі війни.
Chechnya fought twice with Russia for its independence. There were two powerful major wars, and the Chechen population is very hostile towards Russians. Then Russia came up with the idea of installing Kadyrov, its absolute supporter, as the complete ruler of Chechnya. He can do whatever he wants with people there, even kill them. Russia's power in Chechnya is based solely on fear, violence, and weapons. No power can last long if it dominates solely through violence and fear. Therefore, as soon as Russia begins to falter, all of Chechnya will rise up against Russia for its independence.
Going to another country, many people in the UK are very concerned about the treatment of Muslims in Palestine, especially given the war in Gaza. What are your thoughts on the conflict?
Мене часто питають, чому я не виступаю на захист мусульман Гази.
I am often asked why I do not speak out in defense of the Muslims of Gaza, the Muslims of Palestine. Of course, as a Muslim, I sympathize with the mass killings of civilians in Gaza, but I am a Muslim of Ukraine, and I must defend my state, and we must defend our mosques. Just as Muslims from Gaza and Palestine do not come to defend Ukraine, we cannot actually help the Muslims of Gaza in any way, except perhaps with sympathy and prayers. But when they ask me why I don't want to fight for them, I say there are millions of Palestinians. Millions of Palestinians, the Arab world is around them, millions, hundreds of millions of Arabs. Muslims are around, and yet no one wants to help. What do you want from the Muslims of Ukraine, of whom there are very few? I want to emphasize that I sympathize specifically with the Palestinian civilian population. And those people who, for example, are armed, are actually combatants. They bear responsibility, in my opinion. They bear responsibility for the fact that they cannot protect the civilian population. There is another important aspect to the matter. Various groups, including Hamas, are allies of Russia, and they do not hide this. And in fact, they are allies of our enemy, who comes and kills us. And Russia kills any Muslim in Ukraine, kills civilians, civilian children, and non-Muslims. It is unfair and vile to be allies with such a terrorist state as Russia.
Circling back to yourself and your motivations, what does service to a cause mean to you?
Я вважаю, що для мусульман України участь в цій війні і захист своєї держави є джихад. Джихад
I believe that for the Muslims of Ukraine at this time of war, defending their state is jihad. Jihad, in Islamic terminology, is the exertion of effort to do a good deed. Defending one's land comes first. If I hadn't managed to take my family out of Bucha and leave myself, I am sure the Russians would have simply killed us. And if I had been captured by them, they would have tortured me, perhaps. Because they know very well who I am and how I exert informational influence, trying to influence Muslims, including those in Russia, and they react very nervously to my activities there. But Ukraine did not attack Russia. We are defending our children, our families, our mosques, our country, and our freedom, among other things. Therefore, I am sure that the Muslims of Ukraine who are at war are performing jihad.
What do the concepts of democracy and freedom mean to you?
Ну, свобода, це зрозуміло. Це така чеснота.
Well, freedom is clear. It is such a virtue, it is a characteristic inherent in Islam as well, that is, God created man free and gave him freedom of will and freedom of choice. Accordingly, for us, Muslims, being free and independent is natural. That is, a Muslim is a free person. Democracy is a form of government, of power, that grants people rights and freedoms. That is, democracy opposes totalitarianism, opposes authoritarianism, opposes any form of enslavement. Accordingly, by the way, I want to say that the Islamic form of government is very democratic because it provides for the election of leaders, the observance of rights and freedoms. So for us, for the Muslims of Ukraine, a democratic form of government is very inherent in Islam. We understand that different forms of government exist in the world. Democracy prevents dictatorship, prevents absolute power, and prevents the deprivation of people's rights and freedoms. Democracy allows, including for Muslims, to freely practice and preach their religion. That is, when people are granted the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, it ensures us, Muslims, to free existence as Muslims. No one forbids us from doing so.
What would you say to those in the West, in certain sectors of politics there, who claim that Islam is incompatible with democracy and personal freedoms?
Я вважаю, що іслам може поєднуватися з демократією, і взагалі демократичні принципи притаманні релігії
I believe
ісламу.
that Islam can be combined with democracy, and in general, democratic principles are inherent in the religion of Islam. But in the Middle Ages, the most common form of government throughout the world, not only in the Muslim world, was dynastic, royal or sultanic rule. Other forms of government, of course, did not exist for a long time, either in Europe or in the Muslim East. And while Europe moved away from such medieval forms of governance and people's rights began to develop towards democracy, Muslim countries became colonies, including European colonies. And after Muslim countries gained independence in the mid-20th century, they lacked the experience of living in freedom and democracy. Therefore, in many Muslim countries, either a dictator comes to power or there is dynastic rule by a sultan, king, or emir. But there are also examples of democratic countries, for example, in countries like Indonesia, Turkey, Tunisia, and Lebanon. Democratic processes are taking place where people have the right to choose, have certain freedoms, and are fighting for their country to be free, like Ukraine. And there were events called the Arab Spring, when a series of revolutions took place in Muslim countries, and people wanted freedom, free elections, a government they choose, and a government that changes. Therefore, the Muslim world is fighting to become free, and it is difficult. It is difficult in the Muslim world. For me, for example, as a Muslim from Ukraine, as a person living in a free country, I really sympathize with them for constantly living under some kind of dictators. First Muammar Gaddafi, then Bashar al-Assad, then some Ayatollahs. Well, it is awful how to live under a complete dictatorship.
What spiritual virtue is there in democracy?
Ми розуміємо те, що у світі існують різні форми правління. Демократія запобігає диктатурі, запобігає абсолютній владі, запобігає позбавленню людей прав і свобод.
Of course, in any form of government, including democracy, there are shortcomings and flaws, but at least democracy allows us to fight against these flaws. When, for example, some troubles or undesirable phenomena occur in society, such as excessive alcohol or drug consumption or prostitution, but if it is a free democratic country, these flaws can be worked on and fought against. And when you do not have rights and freedoms, then accordingly religious people will not be able to convey that this is wrong, immoral, that they don't like it. Those who say this haven't lived under a totalitarian regime. They haven't seen what it is like.
There are many, especially young people in the West, who are becoming disillusioned with democracy. What would you say to them?
Вони не жили в умовах тоталітарного режиму. Вони не бачили, що це таке. Я народився в Радянському Союзі. І моє дитинство
They
пройшло в
haven't
Радянському
seen what it's
Союзі.
like. I was born in the Soviet Union and my childhood was spent in the Soviet Union. And from my very childhood I saw what it's like to live when you have no rights and freedoms. When you can't even choose what clothes you want to wear, you can't choose what movies to watch, for example, you can't go to mosques or churches, or even if you are a person deprived of rights in the state, you can be sent somewhere just to some kind of imprisonment, prison camps, and so on. That is, any deprivation of people's rights and freedoms inevitably ends badly for that society. For example, when I went to school, we all had to wear the same clothes. We couldn't go abroad. We couldn't buy anything for ourselves because people didn't have the opportunity to buy anything, even if they had money. Our opinions, our desires were absolutely not taken into account. I absolutely don't want to live like in North Korea or like in China or like in Russia, where you decide nothing. The state and state leaders decide for you, and absolutely nothing depends on you. In unfree, undemocratic states, people will never be asked what they want. If they decide that everyone needs to go to war against another state, and the Soviet Union was constantly at war with someone, they will simply take these people and send them to fight, whether they want to or not, whether they know how or not. And there they will simply kill these people. That is, people in Europe do not understand what it is not to be free.
Дякую.
Будь ласка.
This has been Why We Fight. If you enjoyed the program, please consider subscribing to this show or financially supporting my work by following the Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee links below. For my written work and commentary, then check out my Substack, Dictators v Democrats. If you want to join a community of those who believe that democracy is worth fighting for, then feel free to join the Dictators v Democrats Discord server, which is also linked below. And remember, democracy is non-negotiable.